so I would like to actually now introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker is Cyndhia Ramatchandirane. She works as a staff scientist for the fossil fuels team at Earth Justice, based out of New Orleans in Louisiana. Cynthia supports litigation efforts that protect frontline communities impacted by oil, gas, and petrochemical development along the Louisiana-Texas coast. Many of you may know that as the so-called Cancer Alley, as well as here in the Ohio River Valley. Cynthia investigates the potential pollution impacts on climate, the environment, and public fossil fuel infrastructure projects. She works closely with other scientists and local environmental and community groups to address climate and environmental justice issues that these projects would aggravate. And the title of her talk is Fighting Back Against the Blue Hydrogen Buildout Cancer Alley, Louisiana. Cynthia?
Welcome, and thank you for inviting me here to this conference. I've always been a fan. I'm Cyndhia Ramatchandirane. I'm a staff scientist at Earth Justice, and I'm based in New Orleans. The fossil fuels program, the mission of the fossil fuels program is to stop new oil, gas, and petrochemical development in the Ohio River Valley, as well as along the Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast. And today, little green button. All right. I've divided my talk into 3 parts, and I'll actually focus a lot on the first part, which is what is Cancer Alley, and I'll highlight a few studies that show that Cancer Alley is real. I'll briefly describe blue hydrogen and CCS and their impacts, and then I'll end with introducing to you the blue hydrogen build-out that's proposed in Louisiana, and I'll highlight in particular one of the proposals that locals are fighting tooth and nail. So what is Cancer Alley? It's often referred to as the stretch of the Mississippi River that goes between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and even a little further beyond south of New Orleans. These were former plantations, right? They used the Mississippi River for shipping. Eventually, the descendants of enslaved folks were able to purchase land and start their livelihoods, but in the 1900s, chemical and oil and gas facilities started moving in and developed a lot along the river. In the 1980s, many people in this area were realizing that their family members and neighbors were becoming sick with cancer, and they started to connect the dots that the facilities that surround them are polluting the air and their water. And so workers and environmentalists banded together to strike and also to fight this environmental pollution. Similar to parts of the Ohio River Valley, these communities along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans are relatively low in population density. And as Mary described very well, you really need a large population size in order to show a correlation between a pollution problem and environmental health. So this is a challenge. In addition, what makes it challenging is that exposures to these chemical facilities are not the same, right? One plant in one area and a plant in another area will have different kinds of emissions that can lead to different environmental health problems. Cancer, as you know, has a lag time. It can take many years, even decades of exposure before it shows up in the body and is diagnosed. And then Mary kind of alluded to this in her presentation. People move around. So even if they are exposed to some of these things for several years, it may not show up in the data if you use, for example, registry data. So this is a big challenge to measure. Accessibility to healthcare is also another factor that makes it hard to have accurate information. So what's the next best thing? There have been several studies that have looked at cumulative cancer risk around the country. This is a study from ProPublica a few years ago that looked at cancer risk hotspots around the country. And what they did here is they used data from facilities that report to the toxic release inventory, only those facilities that are required to report to the toxic release inventory, and they looked at the hazardous air pollutants that are known to be cancer-causing. So here, what you see is the area between roughly Baton Rouge to almost New Orleans, and the yellow are the yellow labels are all of the chemical facilities that report to the TRI, and in red, the varying shades of red are the cancer risk based on the cancer-causing hazardous air pollutant emissions at those facilities. Oops, I forgot to put that up. So here what they did is they looked at data from 2014 to 2018 and averaged them over a 5-year period. And they also assumed a lifetime exposure of 70 years. This is another study that looked at air pollution hotspots that focused specifically on 3 cancer-causing pollutants: ethylene oxide, formaldehyde, and chloroprene. I couldn't fit the whole thing on this slide, so I encourage you to go check out the link to see the rest of the table. But I just grabbed the top, and you'll see in orange are those census tracts that are in Cancer Alley, most notably in St. John the Baptist Parish, where you have the infamous Denka DuPont plant. And you can see the green bar at the very top is the chloroprene emissions from that facility. It's been in the news a lot in the last year. And you'll also notice in between all the orange lines that there are several census tracts in the Ohio River Valley, notably Lehigh, Pennsylvania, Kanawha, West Virginia, and Harris, Pennsylvania. And then you also see Harris, Texas, which represents Houston. And it's important to understand that while this is showing cancer risk and I'm highlighting cancer risk, this is only the exposure that's added on top of other health risks like respiratory, neurological, and reproductive issues that result from these hazardous air emissions. So Dr. Kim Terrell and her colleague, Gianna St. Julian from the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, who couldn't be here today, were able to conduct a study that shows that Cancer Alley is real. In particular, what they were able to do is show that the air pollution risk was connected to cancer incidence, and that is something that is very difficult to do. And they were able to find that this cancer incidence rate was higher among Black or poor communities in Louisiana. They used publicly available data from the Louisiana Tumor Registry, and another important thing is that that tumor registry data is at the census tract level, not just at in Louisiana we say parish, but it's county level. A parish might wash out your data that can show how communities are exposed to certain facilities because it washes out the proximity to those facilities. So having this census tract level data for the tumor registry is really precious for this kind of study. Oh, and they did account for smoking and obesity rates here. So you might ask yourself, why is this happening? Why are we finding these trends of discrimination of environmental pollution in certain areas? The same authors also conducted a study looking at how environmental air or industrial air permitting occurs in Louisiana. So this is the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. And what they found was that communities of color had 7 to 21 times higher emissions than predominantly white communities in the state. So not just in Cancer Alley, but also in other parts of the state. And that this was not driven by proximity to infrastructure, for example, ports, railways, or labor supply, which is what the agency often falls back on as an argument for why the facilities are permitted where they are. This was my fun little animation that I was sad to lose if it was a PDF. You may recognize this GIF from Fantasia, where Mickey Mouse has the brooms trying to clean the house. Anyways, the reason I put this up there is that the air is already filled with a lot of pollution. And the agency relies on certain standards or rules. Some of you may be familiar with the SILs, the significant impacts levels, to allow more facilities to come into an area that's already polluted, that may even be very close to what's called the NAAQS, or the National Ambient Air Standards. Some folks in the room, I'm going to assume some don't, so I'll go over this. Some facilities can either get permitted as major source or minor source air permits. A major source is when the permitted emissions go above the air standards, right? The ambient air quality standards. And so they have to go through a more rigorous set of requirements and air pollution controls and things, and modeling to show how they're going to control their pollution. If they don't go above that threshold, they can get permitted as a minor source air permit. And what happens is with these minor source air permits, and I'm teeing this up for the blue hydrogen build out, is that if you have multiple minor source air permits that are getting approved in the same area, you could easily have the equivalent of a major source for just one or two communities in the same, neighborhood or census tract. So this is what I wanted to highlight with this animation. Okay, so now I'll move on to blue hydrogen. Again, I'm assuming that most folks here are somewhat familiar with blue hydrogen, so I won't go too deep on this. When I talk about blue hydrogen, I also mean to say blue ammonia or blue methanol, because basically as you produce blue hydrogen, you can then also produce ammonia or methanol. But just to make it easier to talk through, I'll just say hydrogen for here. So blue hydrogen masquerades as clean energy or a low carbon fuel solution. But in fact, it's simply fossil fuels, as was talked about in the introduction. So it's just methane that's cracked to extract the hydrogen molecules to produce hydrogen. And it's called blue because the CO2 emissions from this process are captured. But the tax incentives from the IRA have spurred a huge race to build blue hydrogen facilities all over the country. And along with these blue hydrogen facilities, you have a massive build out of CO2 pipeline network, as well as CO2 injection wells all over the country. And ultimately, this build out would threaten the already polluted communities, including those where our team works along the Texas, Louisiana Gulf Coast, and here in the Ohio River Valley, where there are, I believe, 2 hydrogen hub proposals here. So because blue hydrogen necessitates the use of CCS, it's important to understand the risks of carbon capture and sequestration. Oops, there we go. This is a picture of, actually, sorry, let me back up real quick. For carbon capture, the way that the CO2 is captured, at least the technology that's currently used right now, is to use a solvent that's amine-based. So it's a very intensive, very water-intensive process to capture the CO2 from the gas stream as you produce hydrogen. It's very water intensive, and then these amine-based solvents are discharged into waterways, so it can degrade the water quality. The transport is very dangerous. This picture is a leak near Sulphur, Louisiana in Lake Charles in April, so it's very recent. And local residents were found out about this leak via a Facebook post by the local, Calcasieu Parish Police Jury. And they were told to shelter indoors for a CO2 leak. But CO2, as many of you likely know, is an asphyxiant. So the last thing you want to do is be in an enclosed space. So there was a very poor alerting system, and it took many hours to address this leak. And then this one, again, I'm imagining many of you are aware of this incident in 2020 in Satartia, Mississippi. There was a massive CO2 pipeline rupture that resulted in over 40 people being hospitalized because they fainted, they couldn't breathe, And in addition to that, because the CO2 displaces oxygen, combustion vehicles couldn't work. So first responders couldn't get into the area and people could not evacuate. This was a very dangerous situation. And PHMSA's rules currently for CO2 transportation are very minimal. And they use this incident investigation report to draft new rules, which are unfortunately not published and are currently in limbo. I'm sure I encourage you to check out the Pipeline Safety Trust website, where they have a lot of resources on these CO2 transportation rules. I won't go in detail on the impacts, but I wanted to highlight a few things of impacts of CCS. This is a picture of the Petronova plant. So one thing that will inevitably happen with this massive hydrogen build-out is you need methane. You need shale gas to produce a lot of hydrogen. So all of the upstream impacts from gas production, which all of you already know, apply here. That will only increase with the hydrogen build-out. You have environmental justice problems, which I already explained, and I'll highlight in a moment. These hydrogen proposals are cited in the exact same places where you already have high petrochemical and oil and gas processing. You have air quality problems, water quality problems, and in the case of Louisiana, we have land use issues with wetlands. Our wetlands are disappearing very rapidly, and these facilities and the associated infrastructure like pipelines and injection wells are proposed in these very same wetlands. That is specific to Louisiana, but I'm sure that these other land use issues apply elsewhere as well. It's a false climate solution. You'll still be dealing with upstream methane leaks. You'll also be dealing with CO2 leakage. Hydrogen itself is an indirect greenhouse gas emissions. We don't know how effective these CO2 injection reservoirs are going to be. And then lastly, this is a big deal for communities. The tax incentives and the waivers for these facilities to be built in them take away from the local community's resources. Why is this happening? This project placement is intentional, and this is a quote that I took straight out of the transcript from the Hydrogen Hub Proposal Awards last year. These were the many presentations, and they say, "We are once again coming to frontline communities to ask them to bear the burdens of the clean energy transition simply because so much of the existing infrastructure already exists there." I was just stunned by this quote. And in fact, last summer, the Environmental Integrity Project analyzed the proposals so far, so up to last summer, and found that 90% of the blue hydrogen facilities are proposed near disadvantaged communities. So what is the build-out that we're seeing in Cancer Alley? So Louisiana was not awarded the hydrogen hub proposal that they had with Oklahoma. Nonetheless, there are still almost 20 proposals in Louisiana. This is just some of them along Cancer Alley. So you see Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and the red dots are some of the blue hydrogen proposals. Some of the locations aren't available, so there's a couple missing, and I think one of them is a partially green hydrogen project. We're trying to derive information based on like press announcements, and if a permit application is available, it gets added to the Oil and Gas Watch database. I wanted to point out here, you see like the 5 or so red dots that are clustered in the same area. That's Ascension Parish, and that's where the Air Products proposal is. So these communities are fighting 5 proposals that are right in their same area. This is the Air Products Blue Hydrogen Ammonia project. This one is a little bit different than some of the other proposals in that it is proposing to do the entire thing on its own. That is, it's going to produce the hydrogen, transport the CO2, and also sequester the CO2 emissions. Most projects are just the facilities, and then they have a contract with, say, Denbury/Exxon to take their CO2 emissions. But here, this facility, so the plant is right there, the orange polygon. It is just a few hundred feet from a primary school, the edge of that plant. The red line is a almost 40-mile-long pipeline that goes through, a CO2 pipeline that goes through a wildlife management area. And this is cypress and Tupelo swamp that has a lot of restoration efforts over the past few decades. And then these are the sequestration wells in the lake. This is a beloved lake. A lot of folks recreate, commercially fish there. It's a very popular lake, and folks have been opposing this injection proposal a lot. And whoops, I meant to also highlight the yellow dashes is the gas pipeline that would power the injection wells in the lake. So what are some tools that locals have been using to fight not just air products, but other proposals that are in the same area? There are permit challenges. Every time a company proposes to build a facility, they have to apply for an air permit, a water discharge permit, in our case, wetlands permits. If it's near a major waterway, you'll need a 404 Army Corps permit. So that's one way that communities engage, is to find local counsel or places like Earth Justice and local clinics to challenge these permits. They engage with their local and state officials. I'll show a little bit more about that in the next slide. And they really are trying to build movement in their communities and also across the state, because they understand it's not just happening in their own community, they are noticing this pattern happening elsewhere. So what are some things that are happening? This project is drawing so much wrath in the news. There are more headlines than I have room for on this slide. A lot of communities have also engaged on the Class 6 primacy fight in Louisiana. So Louisiana's authority to approve injection wells for CO2 has been approved, but leading up to that approval, there was a massive effort to stall that primacy approval. And they showed up at the hearings in Baton Rouge and spoke against it. They also encouraged their state representatives to advance bills to declare a moratorium on injection under the lake. There was an air permit hearing for a different facility than the air products one, that they successfully encouraged so many people to attend that they reached capacity, and the fire marshal had to come and shut it down. Even though they had warned the agency that a lot of people were going to show up, they chose a venue that was just too small. And anyway, so if you were to Google just the news around air products Louisiana, you will find more headlines than you can count about how people have been fighting this project and similar ones in the area. And then I just really like this flyer as an example of how folks have been reaching out, have worked together. This flyer might look simple, but it actually took a lot of effort and a lot of collaboration between communications experts, locals on the ground, scientists, and lawyers to come up with a clear message, even just highlighting where the public hearing is, what time, and giving people talking points to either submit in written comments or to speak at the public hearing to talk about some of the reasons why they may not want this project. But doing things like this, going door to door, hosting community events is a big way that folks have been engaging in the area. And then I'll end with this, which was me first of all, it took me forever to find parking for this hearing. This is the air products air permit hearing. And I could barely get in the room. So the picture on the left is me desperately trying to even see. I was too short. That's my phone that you're seeing the view from. So it was successful. Their engagement was really successful. They really packed the room. Most of the people that spoke for the facility were vendors and contractors and the local chambers of commerce in Ascension Parish and Baton Rouge that spoke for the facility. Everyone else, regular folks, parents, because there were a couple schools that are near this facility. The CO2 pipeline will traverse a couple major highways that people used to commute every day. A lot of folks were quite opposed to this facility. And with that, I'll just say that I've put several links in the resources, so if folks want to refer to them at the end, you're welcome to do that. I also put all of Dr. Kim Terrell's and her colleague Gianna St. Julian's papers here. All of these are open access, so you shouldn't have to, they're not paywalled. And these are the two studies and an extra one that I mentioned earlier on Cancer Alley. And I'll leave the questions at the end.
Okay, thank you, Cyndhia. I want to say I love the picture at the end of the young man asking the question at the microphone. I just think that's a great image to leave us with. So I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Eric LaBelle. He is a senior scientist at PSE Healthy Energy, where he started in 2021 after graduating on emissions of methane and other health-damaging pollutants, specifically from abandoned oil and gas wells, as well as residential appliances, such as your gas stove, for example. He has worked to develop new methods for quantifying these emissions and has designed and executed research monitoring campaigns to systematically measure emissions of methane and other pollutants. Dr. LaBelle continues to lead work studying these emissions of methane and other pollutants and their impact on climate, as well as public health. Eric?